Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to Chapter 6. You can see from the title we're going to talk about bones and skeletal tissue. We're going to look at the texture of bone. We're going to look at the microscopic and gross anatomy of bone, structures of long bones and short bones. We're going to talk about the chemical composition of bone. We're going to talk about why calcium is important and how we store calcium in our bones. Pay special attention at the end when we talk about the hormones. We're going to talk about calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, and both of these are important in how we regulate calcium storage in our bones. So when you're really tired at the end, that's when you need to pay special attention. So let's get started. So this slide is showing you about a 12-week-old fetus. Wanted to point out that you can see some of the gaps in bone development. So you can see here in the carpal region, you can see in between the phalanges, you can see here between the frontal bone and the parietal. But initially, the human skeleton consists of cartilage, which is eventually going to be replaced by bone. Remember that cartilage is avascular, so no blood vessels, avascular. Consists primarily of water. There is this perichondrium. This is a layer of dense connective tissue that surrounds the cartilage, and this is has the blood vessels so that we can deliver nutrients, which are going to be glucose and oxygen. And then cartilage is made up of chondrocytes. So remember, we had to know the prefix chondro had something to do with cartilage. These are cells that we'll talk more about a little bit later, and we'll learn about lacunae as well. Here we have the three types of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage, elastic, and fibrocartilage. You probably remember these from Chapter 4 when we talked about the different types of cartilages underneath the category of connective tissue. So hyaline is the most abundant type. It's flexible, it's resilient. This is going to be a lot of the costal cartilage, or what we're going to call articular cartilage. So the cartilage that is on the end of bones as they articulate to other bones. Elastic cartilage, we'll see some examples in just a second, but remember it has a lot more elastic fibers, so it's able to be flexible to bend and recoil. And then we have these collagen fibers that provide great tensile strength, so we'll look at fibrocartilage. Here we have the three types of cartilage and the figure from your book, and it's all color coded so that you can figure out which type of cartilage is present in which location in the body. You can see anywhere that there's blue, this is where we have hyaline cartilage, cartilage of the nose. Anytime you have a bone articulating to another bone, you're going to have cartilage, specifically hyaline. Costal cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage. Then with the green here, the elastic cartilage is here in the external ear and also in the epiglottis. And then we have our fibrocartilages. Might be a little more difficult to see, but here the pubic symphysis between your two hip bones or coxal bones. Back here, the intervertebral discs. And then here at where the femur and the tibia meet, your meniscus. So remember, these are like shock absorbers. Anywhere you have great compression, you're going to have fibrocartilage. If you want a cartilage that's going to be able to be flexible, be able to stretch and then recoil back to its original shape, you're going to have elastic cartilage. Everywhere else that you have cartilage, it's going to be bone-on-bone articulation, and we call that hyaline cartilage. There's two words to describe bone growth. So there's apositional, which is the growth in width, and interstitial, which is in length. In both of these cases, you're going to have chondrocytes. These are the cells that are going to divide. They're going to secrete matrix. So this is kind of like extracellular matrix. It's kind of a protein. And then this is going to get hardened, which we'll see when we look at the chemical composition. And then, so basically, cartilage is expanding and being calcified or hardened and turned into bone. Here are the functions of bones listed for you with a brief explanation on this slide and the next. So obviously bones offer some sort of support for us, right? Support for the body, support for the soft organs. They offer protection. So think of all the places that we have bone. We have the skull, which is around our brain. We have the vertebrae, which are around our spinal cord, and then around our vital organs like our heart, we have the sternum. So basically, if something's encased in bone, it's going to be important. The bones also offer us movement. So we're going to have muscles attached to the bone, and when the muscle contracts, it pulls the bone with it. So the bones kind of act as levers for muscle action. Storage. This one is really important when we talk about hormones. So at the end of the chapter, I'm going to talk about hormones, and they're important in the storage function of bone, which is to store calcium. Bones also function in something called hematopoiesis. You're going to learn more about this in 202 when you talk about blood and how we form erythrocytes and thrombocytes and leukocytes. But for right now, just be familiar with the term hematopoiesis is going to have something to do with blood cell formation, and this happens in the marrow cavities of our bones. Bones also function as storing energy. So we can store fats, triglycerides, if you remember, are fats, which is the same as saying lipids. And that in the bone cavities, if we have yellow marrow, that is basically triglycerides or fat that we're storing inside of our bones in case we need an additional energy source. So if you run through all of the glucose, you can start burning subcutaneous fat, and if you have to, you can start using the fat in the marrow. This last one is kind of a new addition. We didn't used to include it in the functions, but we have realized that there is a hormone that's produced, this osteocalcin, and it's secreted by the bones, and it helps regulate insulin secretion, which has to do with glucose levels and has something to do with metabolism. There are about 206 named bones in the human skeleton, and we divide it into axial and appendicular. So axial is going to be on the axis of the body. So this is your skull, your vertebrae, and your rib cage, where appendicular, think of appendages, right? So your upper and lower limbs. Besides the two divisions, we also classify bones by their shape. So we have long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. Irregular makes sense, right? Complicated shapes, we could figure out what we're talking about. Vertebrae, your os coxa or your coxal bones are very irregular in shape. Flat bones, they're thin, they're flat. This could be the sternum, the scapula, ribs, skull bones. Long bones. Long bones are longer than they are wide, and short bones are cube-shaped. One of the things you should pay attention to, though, that people mistake is, let's look at a phalanx. Let's look at one of your finger bones. It is longer than it is wide, therefore it is actually a long bone. But because they're small, people think they're short bones. So small does not equal short bone. So bones are organs because they contain many different tissue types. So there's nervous tissue, there's nerves running through bone, there's cartilage on the ends of bones, there is fibrous connective tissue that wraps around the bone, there are muscle cells, epithelial cells. Both of these are actually in the blood vessels, and then the blood vessels run through the bone. So this is definitely an organ. And then we're going to look at the three different levels of structure. So we're going to look at the gross anatomy. Remember, this is the whole, or you can think of it as the big picture. And then we're going to look at the microscopic. These are the small individual components that you need a microscope to see. And then we're going to focus on the chemical nature of bone. Here are the two different textures. We have compact bone and we have spongy bone. So spongy bone looks honeycombed, or it looks like Swiss cheese. It would be the section between here and here where you see all of these little spaces or cavities. So this is spongy. The compact would be these really thick sections on the top and bottom. So this is compact bone. Let's look at the structure of short, irregular, and flat. Basically, these have thin plates of spongy bone, and they're covered by compact. That's the picture I just showed you. So there's compact, spongy, and then compact. There's also something called a periosteum, and I'm sure you're seeing kind of the connection here. Anytime you see osteo or osseous, it's going to have something to do with bone, and peri means around. So we have periosteum, which is something that covers the outside of compact bone. We have endosteum, which is something that covers the inside portion of compact bone. And then remember, we have hyaline cartilage. This covers the area of the bone that's at the part of a movable joint, or basically where two bones come together. This figure from the book illustrates this compact, spongy, compact layer, and it is still relatively thin. You can see here the trabeculae of the spongy bone. That's these ridges here. And sometimes we call this structure the diploe. What makes this structure useful for flat bones? So think about the location. They show you a figure of the skull here, so we can think of this as one of the cranial bones. Basically, to get to the brain, you would have to go through a compact, which is a really dense layer. Then you'd have to go through this spongy layer, which is going to be filled with marrow. And then you would have to get through another compact layer in order to actually get to the brain. And again, remember, flat bones would also be the sternum, which is directly in front of the heart. So we have a lot of compression force resistance in this type of structure. It'd be very hard to damage the material on the inside once you get through all these layers. Let's look at the structure of a long bone. So this is a little bit different. We're going to have the diaphysis, cis because there's only one, and we're going to have epiphyses because there are two expanded ends on every long bone. So the diaphysis is going to be compact bone surrounded by a medullary cavity that's going to have some sort of marrow in it. And the epiphyses are going to be the expanded ends that have compact bone external and spongy bone internal. And they're always going to have hyaline cartilage on these joint surfaces where you find two long bones coming together or articulating. That's why they call it articular cartilage. But specifically, it is hyaline cartilage that serves as that articular cartilage. And you're going to see something called an epiphyseal line. And I'll point this out to you. It is the remnant or the remaining of the epiphyseal plate. So basically, if you have an epiphyseal plate, you're able to grow bone. If you have an epiphyseal line, you are now an adult and that period of bone growth has ceased. Here's the figure from your book, and this kind of explains a little bit more visually what I've been talking about. So here's the proximal end of the epiphysis. So see, it's singular here, IS, where on the other slide it was SES, which meant plural. Here's the diaphysis, and here's the distal end. So see, we had to know proximal and distal. So this should tell you this is closest to the shoulder. How do I know that? I know by the features that this is the humerus. And so this distal end would be where you would find the radius, and the ulna. Okay, here's the medullary cavity. Here's the marrow we talked about. And then here are the epiphyseal ends where we have the spongy bone, but it still has compact bone on the outside. But this, the diaphysis, here's the compact bone, the cavity, and then compact bone. Here's the articular cartilage. And here is that epiphyseal line that I was talking about. So if you have an epiphyseal line, you can automatically tell that this is the humerus of an adult. Now we get to look at the inside a little bit more. We're still on gross anatomy, but we're going to look at the periosteum layer. Remember, this is the fibrous layer that externally covers, except for at the joint area, which we'll talk more about in Chapter 8. So there's the fibrous layer of the periosteum, and it has something called perforating fibers. And then there's also an osteogenic layer. So this is one layer of the periosteum. This is the second layer of the periosteum. And inside we have all of these cells. We're going to come back and define each of these, but I kind of gave you a little heads up. So blast is going to be bone-forming cells, or sometimes I call them building. Clasts are used for cutting or destroying bone. Osteogenic cells are the stem cells that make osteoblasts. And then osteocytes are mature bone cell. So once an osteoblast has matured, it's now an osteocyte. Again, we'll come back and talk more about those later, but you can see they all start with osteo. We're going to see the nerves and the blood vessels enter through holes or foramina in the periosteum layer. There's also an endosteum or an inner layer. This is connective tissue covering the internal bone surface. It's going to line the canals. It's going to cover the trabeculae of the spongy bone. Like the periosteum, it also has osteogenic cells that can differentiate into other bone cells. So basically you have an outer layer and you have an inner layer, and both of these have cells that can cause bone growth, right? That can create osteoblasts, which then turn into osteocytes, which we'll cover in just a few minutes. Again, here's a great figure. So this internal lining, this is the endosteum. This outer white lining is the periosteum. You can see it wraps around. And then you can see the foramina where we're going to see the blood vessels. So nutrients and arteries that are delivering nutrients are able to innervate the bone. They go through these canals within the bone that we'll talk about in just a moment, but they have to be able to get inside the bone, so they have to get through this fibrous coating, and that's why we have these nutrient foramina. Also, you can see the Sharpie's fibers here. The periosteum, it anchors to the bone through these perforating fibers, so it allows for this outer connective tissue layer to attach to the bone and allow for blood vessels to innervate. Let's talk a little bit about marrow. So first we have red marrow, and there's that word again, hematopoietic. So the hematopoietic tissue is anything that's going to eventually help develop blood cells. So red marrow, it's found in adults, in the spongy bone, in the epiphyses of the femur and the humerus, in some of the flat bones. In infants, the medullary cavities all have red marrow. We talked about yellow marrow in the terms of fatty marrow or lipids or fat that are stored in your long bones. So basically this yellow marrow is going to provide energy if needed. So some of the red marrow converts to yellow marrow as you age, and this provides an alternative energy source. If you run out of glucose and you run out of subcutaneous fat, you can use the yellow marrow stored in your long bones to create ATP. The next couple of slides I'm going to have you look at on your own. Basically, I wanted to mention projections that we're still in the category of gross anatomy, things that are whole that you can see with your eyes. So these bone markings, there's different types. There's projections, there's depressions, and there's openings. The main reason I want to mention these is that we need to have some of these rough projection points because we're going to have muscle attachment. So bones aren't smooth for a reason. We need to have points of attachment for bone to bone, which would be a ligament, and we need to have points of attachment where we're going to take a tendon from a muscle and we're going to attach it to the bone. And again, since the bones act as levers for the muscles, we have to have a nice foundation or a rough spot that we can anchor this tendon to. Now we get to change topics and start talking about microscopic anatomy. So the first thing we're going to talk about in a little more detail are these cells. So there are 4 major types of cells. I know your book lists 5, but I want to stick with these 4. So we're going to look at osteogenic, and you should think maybe genetics. These are going to be the stem cells. We're going to look at blasts, which build bone. We're going to look at cytes, which are mature bone. And then we're going to look at clasts, which cut or break bone down. So even more information. Osteogenic cells, these are stem cells. They're located in the periosteum and the endosteum. When stimulated, they are going to differentiate into osteoblasts. So osteogenic cells become osteoblasts. We still have to have some remaining stem cells. This is very similar to when we looked at the skin. and we looked at the stem cells which generated more keratinocytes. Right? The osteoblasts are bone-forming cells. They're going to secrete this unmineralized, meaning it's not hardened yet. So they're going to secrete proteins. They're going to secrete extracellular matrix in these little vesicles, which we call osteoids. The next two, we have osteocytes. These are mature bone cells. They're in something called lacunae or lacunae. They're no longer able to divide. These are mature. That's probably the key word there. And I'll show you how they become mature. How does an osteoblast turn into an osteocyte? I'll show you in just a moment. Osteoclasts, these are giant cells, multinucleated, so they're from the fusion of many cells that did not separate during mitotic division. And these help break down. They have a lot of digestive enzymes which can break osteocytes down and allow for the release of calcium and phosphorus into the bloodstream. So the next category of microscopic bone, we need to look at compact bone. So what would happen if we took a sliver of compact bone and we put it underneath the microscope? What would we see? Well, one of the major things we would see is something called an osteon. And again, we have the same word prefix here, right? So osteon is going to have something to do with bone. It's a structural unit of compact bone, specifically compact bone. You will not see osteons in spongy bone. They act kind of as weight-bearing pillars or columns. The second thing you're going to see is lamellae or lamellae. So these are osteon cylinders that kind of form rings. So we'll talk about two different kinds, the circumferential lamella, lamellae for plural, or interstitial. And these are going to help with resisting stress and twisting. Again, another figure from your book doing a great job of showing you osteons. So I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 full osteons, and these are 2 halves. For the lamella or lamellae, this is plural, right? These are the circumferential. They wrap around the entire circumference. And then individual lamellae are going to be these individual sections here. So we call these interstitial. So they're in between 2 osteons. One of the more interesting aspects of an osteon, which is being shown here, is that in each lamella, each one here, each layer, you're going to see collagen fibers that run in different directions. So we said that these layers help resist with the stress of twisting, and I'm not sure if you can really follow here, but these collagen fibers run from a right to left, these are left to right, and then these come back and form the right to left pattern. So if you have this pattern, it gives you much more stability and resistance to twisting and pulling. Some more features of compact bone that we have to talk about are the canals. We call these central canals, and the canaliculi. So canaliculi are tiny little channels, so we'll see those. We also have perforating canals. We can go back to a figure, look at the central canal, and if you notice inside the central canal, you're going to have nerves, arteries, and veins. So you're going to have a nerve, you're going to have a vein that's carrying away deoxygenated blood and waste, and you're going to have an artery that's bringing in blood and glucose. You're going to have perforating canals. So we have central canals here, and then if we want to get to the internal section where we would store, say, yellow marrow or red marrow, depending on what type of bone we are, we need perforating canals. So they form these right angles off of the central canal to get to the interior portion. Also, we have canaliculi. So these are tiny little channels within the lamella that you'll see connect osteocyte to osteocyte. Another thing to point out is that all of this is compact bone. So anytime you see osteons densely packed, this is compact bone. All of this internal is spongy bone. So remember, we have periosteum here, we have compact bone here, We have end osteum, and then we have spongy bone. So I showed you canaliculi just a moment ago. These are hair-like channels that are going to connect lacunae or lacunae to each other. So these are small cavities contained by the osteocytes, and we're going to look at what happens. But basically, osteoblasts are going to secrete bony matrix. So again, we're talking like extracellular matrix, proteins. The matrix or the proteins are going to harden, and the cells become trapped, and we now call them osteocytes. So an osteocyte is basically an osteoblast that has secreted matrix, and that matrix has been hardened. Again, here's an expanded, more detailed figure from your book. So canaliculi is many, canaliculus is one. So these canaliculi, these little tiny hair-like channels, allow for osteocytes to talk to each other. So this is an osteocyte, and it's in a lacuna, which lacuna just means lake. And this lake is matrix, and that matrix is going to become hardened. So a lacunae is a lake. The osteocyte is the cell inside the lacunae, and then these canaliculi are little channels in which osteocytes can talk to each other. And each of these layers are called lamella, or together, lamellae. Now we get to talk about the anatomy of spongy bone, specifically the microscopic anatomy. So how does spongy bone look different than compact bone? And you've already seen some figures, but we have something called trabeculae, and these are kind of like cables on a suspension bridge. They align along lines of stress. There are no osteons in spongy bone. Instead, you have the trabeculae. There's no figure in your book, so I stole this, but I gave them credit. So here's the website if you'd like to go and look at the picture on your own. But I wanted to show you that we still have osteoblasts, osteoclasts, osteocytes, canaliculi, lamella, and trabecula when we look at spongy bone. So all of the same components are there, it's just rearranged in a little different fashion. Now we get to move to the fun stuff, which is the chemical composition of bone. So we have 1, organic components, and 2, the inorganic. When you see organic, think of the cells. All the blasts, the clasts, remember the osteoids, this is the bone matrix that gets secreted by the osteoblast that eventually gets hardened. Think of the inorganic as the minerals. So basically this bone matrix is going to be mineralized by hydroxyapatites. What are hydroxyapatites? It's really calcium and phosphate that's been crystallized around collagen. Remember, bone has lots of collagen, which is what makes it flexible. So this hydroxyapatite is responsible for the hardness and the resistance to compression of bone. So what's so great about this hard and flexible system? So we have the collagen, which allows the bone to be flexible, and we have the calcium phosphate crystals, or the hydroxyapatites, that allow for the bone to be hard. So we can still move around, but we also have this hardness or resistance to compression. The next topic is going to be bone development, or osteogenesis. I quite frequently say ossification. They're both words that you can use to talk about bone development. You're going to see bone formation beginning at about the 2nd month of development. Your postnatal bone growth, we're saying it happens until early adulthood. What I want you to focus on is that bone remodeling is a lifelong event. So you are always repairing bone and remodeling bone depending on the stress and the pressure that you're putting on the bones. Before we move into ossification, I want to make sure we have just a general summary of bone development. So what's happening in the compact and the spongy bone? We have osteogenic cells, which make osteoblasts. The osteoblasts are going to produce a matrix, and that matrix is called osteoids. What do they have in them? I kept saying proteins, and they do. They have glycoproteins, and they have proteoglycans. They also have collagen fibers. Again, this is a protein. And those collagen fibers are in the secreted matrix. The matrix is then going to be mineralized or hardened, with the inorganic component. Remember that inorganic component was that hydroxyapatite. And then we call that mature bone or osteocytes. There are two types of ossification depending on what type of bone is going to form. So up to about 8 weeks, you're going to see this process where we have fibrous membranes and hyaline cartilage in the fetal skeleton that are going to be replaced with bone tissue. So remember, all bone originated from cartilage. Basically, what's on this slide is the majority of what I need you to know. I'm going to walk through the steps of each ossification process, but you can just write a general big picture. So there's intramembranous ossification, and this is the process if you're going to create flat bones. So basically, we're going to have this membrane bone developed from fibrous membrane. And then we have endochondral ossification, and this forms all the bones below the skull, and you could mostly think of this as long bones. So first we can see in intramembranous ossification, we're going to start with stem cells. Remember, this is happening in the embryo or developing fetus, right? So we have stem cells that come together, and they're going to differentiate into osteoblasts. So these are osteoblasts, and you can see they're secreting matrix, and these are called osteoids, right? Next step, when we see these osteoids that are secreted, they're going to start being calcified or mineralized. And this is a great picture showing you an osteocyte that's now been trapped by bone mineralization. So these little osteoids produced by the osteoblast were hardened, and now we have a cell that's trapped in bone, and that's an osteocyte or a mature bone cell. In this last step, we can see something that looks like this diploid structure, or this compact, spongy, compact structure, right? And we can still see our osteoblasts, which are going to be able to build bone. Endochondral ossification requires the breakdown of hyaline cartilage that's going to be ossified. So basically, hyaline cartilage is going to turn into bone. So here we have our hyaline cartilage. We're going to go through the steps. Again, you can look at these, but the major idea that you get is that there's a primary center, which forms the medullary cavity, and then we start with these secondary ossification centers, which are going to create those epiphyseal ends. Again, here is your epiphyseal line. Remember, when it becomes a plate is when the cartilage is no longer actively dividing and turning into bone. So you can see that endochondral ossification is great for creating long bones, where the intramembranous ossification was great for creating flat bones. We already mentioned the terms interstitial growth and apositional growth. So bone increases lengthwise by interstitial growth and increases thickness by apositional. So you can think width and length. And this goes into a little bit more detail from the ages here and talking about the increased stress and muscle activity. But let's look at the next figure to look at kind of the growth plate or epiphyseal plate. They enlarged a section of one of the epiphyseal ends, and we can see here there's several different zones, and they're numbered. I do not have the zones on the chapter review sheet for you. I wanted you to just have a general understanding of how the growth in length works in long bones. So if this is still cartilage, this cartilage has to go through a division process. So here it's still a plate, right? So plate is cartilage, it can still turn into bone. And you're going to see that the cells are going to go through mitosis. They're going to become enlarged. Eventually they're going to calcify, and now you're going to have an ossification zone where you actually have new bone forming. So one of the things that people usually mention in a traditional class is they talk about people who have, especially adolescents, small children who have not stopped the growth process. They'll have a break in this one of the zones within their epiphyseal plate. So if you have a break, these cells cannot turn into bone. So basically you've damaged this epiphyseal plate, and it's going to cause growth to be inactive, or it's going to cause growth in one arm to continue on its normal rate where the other one is going to be slowed down. Now we have ways of fixing that, steroids and growth factors, but it used to be a problem a while ago where if you broke a growth plate, there was nothing they could do, and you would have one arm that was shorter than the other, or one leg. If we want to grow in width, we're also going to do bone remodeling. So we can see here, this is the epiphyseal plate, which helps us grow in length, correct? We also have cartilage that can still be growing here, the articular cartilage, and you can see here that as your bone grows in length, we might also have to change the shape or the epiphyseal ends. This could also be due to stress. It could be due to muscle attachment. So bones are constantly growing or remodeling themselves, especially in this width area, even after they're not remodeling themselves in length any longer. We need to talk about hormone regulation. So we have something called growth hormone. This is a hormone that's released from our pituitary gland, and it stimulates not only skeletal growth but also muscle growth. We have something called thyroid hormone. This has something to do with metabolism. We'll learn more about this in 202 when we talk about the endocrine system. But the thyroid hormone kind of acts as a helper for your growth hormone. We also have estrogen and testosterone. So this is male hormone, right? And this is female hormone. And at puberty, we usually have these growth spurts due to the elevated levels of estrogen and testosterone. But they also signal the events that end the growth period and signal the epiphyseal line formation. This is a great figure where you can see the little gaps here. So you can see that these little sections are still cartilage. So this would not be an adult, this would be a child, or this would be an adolescent, right? So you can see that the bone has not fully fused as it would in an adult. We like to say that mature bone is metabolically active. Basically, your entire life, spongy bone is being created and replaced, and so is compact bone. So what do osteoblasts and osteoclasts do for us? So osteoclasts are the ones that build bone, right? So anytime you're injured or you need to add strength due to stress, you're going to build bone. You have to have proteins, you have to have vitamin C and D and A, you have to have calcium and phosphorus. Remember, these are the minerals that harden. You have to have magnesium and manganese. Bone reabsorption, or osteoclasts, remember, these are going to cut bones. These osteoclasts secrete lysosomal enzymes. They're digestive enzymes that dissolve the matrix, and then they allow for the products, or the calcium and the phosphate, to cross over into the interstitial fluid and then into the blood. So basically we can use the bone as a storage or a reservoir for calcium. So what controls the remodeling? We have hormones, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. We have to monitor calcium in the blood, and I'll talk about why in just a moment. But the second item that controls remodeling is stress. So there's a Wolff's Law that says bone grows or remodels in response to forces or demands placed upon it. So I usually like to think of, if you're trying to strengthen bone, I know it's silly, but you can go to the Kill Bill movie where she's got her hand and she's trying to break through this board at a very close distance. You're basically building up the bone density because you're putting stress on it. So if you're constantly hitting your hand over and over again, you're creating microfractures, and those are going to harden and heal, and eventually you're going to have strong, denser bone at the area that you keep putting stress on repeatedly. Let's talk a little bit more about the hormones. We have parathyroid hormone. It's produced by the parathyroid glands, and these are posterior to your thyroid. If you have low blood calcium levels, parathyroid hormone is released. It stimulates osteoclasts to break bone down, so cut bone. And when it cuts down the bone, it releases calcium into the bloodstream. So if the blood was low, blood calcium level was low, and now you put calcium into the bloodstream, that should fix the problem. Calcitonin is if you want to tone down calcium. So if your calcium levels are too high, Calcitonin is secreted from the thyroid. See, these are both in alignment with each other. These are on the back of the thyroid. The parathyroid is behind, next to the thyroid, and it's going to lower blood calcium levels. We really don't see this too much in humans. It's not really active, but it's good to understand both of these hormones because they're antagonistic. They work in opposite of each other. So if you understand one, it's easy to understand the other. So I have a flow chart here for you. You should be able to take this flow chart and turn it into sentences. So on your exam, if I asked you to explain the hormonal control of calcitonin and parathyroid hormone on the bones, you could explain this in complete sentences, not just this flow chart. If your blood calcium is high, so high levels of blood calcium, we're going to release calcitonin from the thyroid. It's going to target the osteoblasts. What do osteoblasts do? They build bone. So when they make bone, we're going to pull calcium from the blood. So your calcium is too high. We're going to make bone or build bone, and we're going to steal the calcium from your blood, which is going to cause the calcium levels to go down or decrease. The other thing that the hormone can do is tell the osteoblasts to stop cutting, right? Stop cutting bone. Anytime you cut bone down, you release calcium into the bloodstream. Well, calcium is already too high. We don't want to do that. Now we get to look at what happens if you have low blood calcium. So if the blood calcium levels are low, parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid. It tells the osteoclasts, remember these cut bone, to break bone down and release calcium into the blood. So if you had low calcium, we break bone down and we add calcium to the blood, we now have high blood calcium. So we bring the calcium level back up. What does it also tell osteoblasts? Remember, these build bone. So if our blood calcium level is already low, we don't want to remove any calcium from the bloodstream because we already have too little. So there's no time to build bone right now. I'm hoping that we see with this both parathyroid and calcitonin, I hope we see the homeostatic balance, and that if it's high, we make it low, or if it's low, we make it high. And remember, this is what type of feedback. If you started with high and it went to low, or you started with low and you went to high, it's the opposite. And remember, we called that negative feedback. Why is calcium important? We're sitting here talking about hormones. We're talking about being able to store calcium and release calcium. So we need to know why calcium is important. And all of these are the reason. So we need calcium for nerve transmission. For your brain to talk to the rest of your body, you need calcium. In order for muscles to contract, we need calcium. And I'm talking about all three. Cardiac, smooth, skeletal. Blood coagulation. In order for blood to gel and form fibers and form a clot, you have to have calcium. And secretion by glands and nerve cells sometimes is activated by calcium. So in order for the gland to secrete its product, or the nerve to secrete something, it's going to need calcium as a trigger. So changes in calcium levels can be serious. If your calcium level is too low, so hypo means low, calcemia means calcium, and hyper means high. Either way, if your calcium is too low, it can lead to muscle spasms, tremors. Basically, everything is hyperexcitable. If you have hypercalcemia, it can depress your nervous system. You can become non-responsive. So isn't it great? It says, why do bones need calcium? Why would we secrete hormones to tell our bones to store calcium? This is a great system. We don't want too little calcium. We don't want too much calcium. We want just right. So what can we do? We store calcium in our bones so we have a ready access and supply of calcium should we need it. So if we have too much calcium, we can store it in our bones. If there comes a time that we have too little calcium, we can pull it out of our bones. So this is a great dynamic system, and it shows the real importance of our skeletal bones to store calcium for all of these needs that we might have. Let's look at a real-world example. So we have braces here. Your teeth are not really bone. Your teeth are made up of the same chemical structure, the calcium and the phosphate, but they're not really bone. So we're going to focus on the maxilla and the mandible here. What's happening are the mechanical stresses due to the brackets and the wire on the teeth are causing the osteoclasts to break bone down and causing the osteoblasts to build bone in different areas. The wire here allows for, once the clast has broken down the bone, the wire allows for the tooth to come into alignment, and then the osteoblast is going to shore up the connection here between the tooth and the alveolar cavity or process of the maxilla. Things to consider in space travel. In space travel, you might have an extended period of time where there's no gravity. So right now, being on the Earth, gravity is putting a certain amount of stress or pressure on our bones and causing them to build and break down in different ways. Without that gravity or that constant stress, you sometimes will have clasts which will outpace the blasts. So remember, the blasts are going to build and the clasts are going to cut. So if you're cutting bone down faster than you're building bone, that can lead to osteoporosis or holes or pores in the bone. You can also think that it's much easier to cut or tear down a house than it is to build one. Let's look at some of the bone fractures. So many of these can be either or classifications. I'm going to have several numbers here for you and I'll explain as we move on. But non-displaced versus displaced. Basically, are the ends in the normal position or are they out of alignment? So you can see in this fracture, the bone is still basically in its normal alignment, where in this figure, the bone has shifted slightly over. So this would be a displaced and this would be a non-displaced fracture. You can also have completeness of the break. You can have a complete or you can have an incomplete. It's either broken all the way through or not broken all the way through. But again, you can see how some of these classifications can't occur without the other. So this right here, this is displaced. It has to also be complete. There's no way to have a displaced fracture if it's incomplete. Classification 3 and 4, we can see the example here if there is a compound fracture. That means it has to penetrate the skin. A simple means it does not penetrate the skin. But you can see from this figure, if it's compound, it also has to be displaced and complete. So you wouldn't use all three, you would probably just say compound, and the only way for it to penetrate the skin is if it happens to fit those two classifications as well. And then sometimes we refer to the orientation. You can have a spiral break, you can have an oblique, you can have a transverse. When you look in your textbook in chapter 6, you can see these different tables that talk about common fracture types. You can see comminuted, where you can see the bone has been fragmented. You can see compression, where some sort of force has crushed the bone. This next figure, we can see a spiral fracture. We can also see an epiphyseal fracture. Remember, this was an epiphyseal plate. This was really cartilage. It has not calcified yet, so it's not bone. So under extreme circumstances, this is the area that's the weakest in the bone that can be twisted or broken. You can see in this third slide, there's a depression, and there's also something called the green stick. This is common in children whose bones have relatively more organic, so they're talking about collagen here. So more collagen, which is flexible than those in adults. If you had a fracture, what would be the treatment and the repair? Well, first, the treatment usually involves some sort of reduction or realignment of the broken ends, especially if you had a complete fracture. If you had a comminuted fracture, you might actually have to put in pins or plates to realign the broken bone fragments. The next thing you're going to do is do immobilization, so by cast or traction to allow for the healing process. Remember, osteoblasts take a little while to work in order to create new bone. One of the things I want to point out at the bottom here, when we look at the repair, you can see the individual steps at the bottom, but some things that you should understand is, remember that bone is highly vascularized. So bone is highly vascularized. Why? Because we have to get calcium in and out of our bloodstream. So when a fracture occurs, you're going to see this hematoma or blood form between the bone, the break, and remember this is the periosteum. Once the hematoma forms, you're now going to have the repair process starting, and you're going to see fibrocartilage. Remember, cartilage is what gets ossified and turned into bone, so we have to lay the foundation with the cartilage. We also have to make more collagen. So remember, we have fibroblasts in connective tissue, which would help generate collagen fibers. The next thing you're going to have is a bony callus forming. Basically, this cartilage is being ossified or turned into bone to replace or heal the fracture. And then you see here there are little pieces of bone that kind of stick out, or little pieces of calcified cartilage that are sticking out into the periosteum, and those are going to have to be remodeled. So any excess pieces are going to be cut by osteoclasts, and then now we have the more normal structure of the bone before the fracture occurred. Let's look at bone disorders. I've grouped these two together, osteomalacia and rickets. Basically, let's look at the cause first. If you don't have enough vitamin D or enough calcium in your diet, remember vitamin D allows you to absorb calcium. So they go hand in hand. If you don't have enough in your diet, it results in weak bones. And why is this? Because we're going to take the calcium out of our blood and we're going to use it to make hydroxyapatite and make our bones strong. So you can see the difference between normal anatomy and someone that has rickets. It causes these kind of bowed femurs, and then it causes weak bones in general. What's interesting is now that we know a little bit about hormones, we should be able to look at this statement. Most patients have elevated parathyroid hormone. So remember, if you have low blood calcium, parathyroid hormone is going to be released from the parathyroid gland, and parathyroid hormone is going to go to the osteoclasts and tell them to break bone down and release calcium into the blood. So if these patients or these people are not consuming enough vitamin D or enough calcium, their body thinks they're in continual low blood calcium levels, right? So where can you grab some extra calcium if you need it? You can start breaking down bone and release that into the bloodstream. Well, if you never replace the bone that you broke down, that results in weak bones. Next, we can look at osteoporosis, telling you basically this means bone and this means pores. And we've briefly mentioned this before, but it's a loss of bone mass. So bone breakdown outpaces bone deposit. So the clasts are working much faster than the blasts, osteoblasts, right? And you can see here there are tiny little holes in this case, this is spongy bone, so these are in the trabeculae of the bone, and you can see the little holes. Well, it causes the bones to be susceptible to fracture. So what are some of the risk factors and some of the treatments? So a lack of estrogen. What they're saying is as estrogen decreases, your increased risk for osteoporosis. So if you have a lack of estrogen, what can you do? You can replace the estrogen. This is most common in some cases, I should say, if we're talking about postmenopausal women. So women who've gone through menopause, their ovaries are no longer ovulating oocytes or eggs. Your diet. So if you do not ingest or take in enough calcium or vitamin D, you're not going to be able to build bone, and that can also increase your risk of osteoporosis. There's a word in here, calcitrol. It's also in your book. It is the activated form of vitamin D. So you can ingest vitamin D, but it has to be in the activated form before it helps increase your calcium absorption in your small intestines. So if you didn't have enough calcium or vitamin D, then you could always take those. Some are out of our control. So petite body form, this is genetic. There's nothing we can really do about that. But insufficient exercise and smoking, we can do something about both of those. So now we look at Paget's disease. This is excessive bone formation in very specific areas. So it's not happening all over. But the bone is very spongy and it has reduced mineralization, so it's not as hard. We don't know the cause, so there's still things in anatomy that we don't understand. We think it is possibly viral or genetic, so somehow a virus is either inserting into the gene or there's a gene and we just don't know. One of the treatments is calcitonin because in these individuals they have very high blood calcium levels. So the calcitonin will tone down the blood calcium level. Some other factors, we've talked about vitamins like vitamin D, and we said that vitamin D has to be activated. And when vitamin D is activated, then you can have intestinal absorption of calcium. Growth factors as well. So we release hormones that activate growth factors. If you have increased growth factors and you're an adult, that can cause something called acromegaly. So you can have unwanted or excessive growth in your face. It seems to affect the skull most, the hands. If you're a child and you have decreased growth factors, then you can be short in stature. This is not the same as the genetic disposition that causes dwarfism or achondroplasia. They're two different mechanisms for being short in stature. Also, your thyroid hormones. So sometimes we'll say somebody has a high metabolism or a low metabolism. This is really what we're talking about. We're talking about these T3 and T4 hormones. So again, remember, metabolism is any reaction that's happening in the body in terms of building things up or breaking things down. So T3 and T4 work with growth factors. So these two kind of rely on each other. And then sometimes we can look at sex hormones. And remember that estrogen and androgen, which is really testosterone or precursor to testosterone, these cause that growth spurt that we talked about earlier. So there's more than just one factor here at play. It's the amount of calcium, it's the amount of vitamin D, it's your growth factors, it's genetics, it's your metabolism, and then it's also the level of sex hormones. So it's a little bit more complicated than what we're discussing here. And of course, we're going to talk about the developmental aspects just briefly. So here you can see that ossification begins by about 8 weeks, with those primary ossification centers creating the medullary cavity and the long bones at about week 12. At birth, most of the long bones are well ossified, except at the ends. Remember the epiphyseal ends, epiphyseal plate versus line. At age about 25, all the bones are completely ossified and the skeleton ceases to grow. Bone mass, mineralization, and healing ability decrease with age at about your 4th decade, which is at about 40. So basically, as you get older, you have less bone, less mineralization occurring, and less healing ability. This is also interesting that most bones are completely ossified by 25. This is how in some of those TV shows, those NCIs, those bones type of TV programs, they'll walk up to a skeleton and they'll say, oh, this has to be a woman over the age of 25 or 30. They're looking at the ossification of all of the skeletal bones, specifically the hips, and then of course the long bones at the epiphyseal ends. So there is a science to this. You can spend a whole lifetime studying bones and being able to glean information just based on the structure of a skeletal bone. Well, I'll see you guys next chapter. Bye.